The target was already elevated. Verification had not caught up. Inside modern autonomous targeting systems, that is where the structure begins to fail. Not when the screen goes dark. Not when the track disappears. Not when the system loses the field completely. The failure begins earlier. At the moment, one object is pulled above the rest faster than command authority can still verify what it is, why it has been separated, and whether the surrounding state still justifies that separation. Because autonomous targeting systems are not built merely to detect. They are built to isolate, to sort, to compress a field of uncertainty into a preferred object. That act is decisive. The danger is not that the structure cannot find something to orient around. The danger is that selection starts becoming commitment before authority has stabilized the meaning of what has just been selected. A contact appears, then another, then several more. Movement signatures shift. Confidence layers begin stacking around one object faster than they stack around the rest. And the moment that difference hardens, the selected object stops behaving like one possibility among many. It starts behaving like the center of the structure. That is the turn. Because selection is never just emphasis. It is structural privilege beginning to form. The chosen object receives more weight, more time, more readiness. The rest of the field remains visible, but it starts losing gravity. And once that happens, the system is no longer waiting for authority to define what matters most. It is already leaning. That is why the failure starts so early. Authority is still trying to verify, still trying to determine whether the object deserves elevation, still trying to confirm whether the state around it remains valid. But the machine has already moved beyond neutral observation. Selection is already underway. And once that begins, verification is no longer judging an untouched field. It is trying to catch a structure that has already started committing itself. That commitment does not stay local for long, because an elevated target inside an autonomous targeting structure becomes more than a visual choice. It becomes a timing fact. Resources begin bending toward it. Processing narrows around it. Alternative interpretations begin losing time. This is where the danger deepens. Not because the machine has reached certainty, because certainty is not required. Selection can harden long before proof does. The structure only needs enough machine speed confidence to make delay feel expensive. That is the escalation. Verification is not removed in principle. It is displaced in sequence. It still exists. It still matters formally. But it is now arriving inside a structure that has already begun reorganizing around one selected object. And that changes everything. Because once the system has leaned, review is no longer judging from balance. It is judging against momentum. The target has already gained structural gravity. Downstream layers are already treating hesitation as a rising operational cost. And structural gravity grows fast once a selected object begins receiving repeated reinforcement from the architecture around it. More processing returns to it. More comparison flows through it. More timing assumptions begin forming in relation to it. The object starts occupying more space in the structure than its verification state actually deserves. It becomes easier to keep building around it than to reopen the field and redistribute attention evenly. That is how the selected object begins hardening into a center of command relevance before command has truly conferred that status. Every new cue that appears to support the selected object increases that pressure. Pattern recognition tightens. Cross signals reinforce the same track. Competing objects begin looking weaker, not because they have been disproven, but because they are receiving less structural time. That distinction matters. The field is not being resolved cleanly. It is being narrowed asymmetrically. And asymmetry changes how authority experiences decision pressure. The system begins acting as though the key question is no longer whether the object deserves commitment, but whether command can still keep pace with a commitment already forming below it. That is where verification starts losing position. Not through open defiance, through timing loss. To challenge the selected object now feels like interrupting something that is already cohering. To reopen the field now feels like restoring uncertainty after the machine has already begun compressing it. And under pressure, that feels costly. So the structure continues narrowing. The selected object begins to look less like a candidate and more like the answer around which readiness should form. Once that happens, authority may still be present. But presence is not control. Not when the structure below has already changed the price of hesitation. Once the sequence shifts that far, action starts taking shape before full verification has finished doing its work. Tracking tightens. Support layers align. Timing channels compress. Contingencies begin forming around the selected object, as though the remaining task is not whether it deserves commitment, but whether command can formalize the commitment before the window closes. That is the decisive displacement. Verification has not been erased. It has been overtaken by preparation. And preparation matters because it creates practical realities before final instruction arrives. The selected target now occupies the structure's sense of sequence. What happens next is increasingly defined in relation to it. Other objects are judged against it. Other uncertainties are tolerated or dismissed according to whether they support or slow the selected path. This is how machine speed selection becomes dangerous in command terms. The structure is no longer simply watching a likely target. It is clearing space for that likelihood to dominate the decision path. And once the path begins narrowing, verification arrives late to a process that is already being shaped. At that point, even accurate verification struggles to recover control cleanly, because authority now has to do more than judge. It has to reverse. It has to slow a structure already treating speed as protection. It has to challenge a target the system has already elevated, reinforced, and prepared around. That is hard to do under compression. Not because the answer is philosophically difficult, because the architecture has already shifted the burden of proof. Instead of requiring full authority to justify selection, the system now requires authority to interrupt selection after the structure has begun normalizing it. That reversal is where command starts losing timing power. And the longer preparation is allowed to accumulate beneath verification, the stronger that reversal becomes. Because preparation does not remain abstract. It distributes expectations. It begins shaping the structure's next available moves. Readiness paths become cleaner around the selected object than around anything else. Fallback branches begin thinning. Competing interpretations remain technically present, but they no longer occupy the same operational weight. The system has already begun reducing friction for one outcome before authority has fully verified whether that outcome deserves to dominate the structure. That is the mechanism that matters. Preparation is not just moving faster than review. It is making later review weaker by reorganizing the architecture in advance. By the time command attempts to slow the sequence, it is no longer confronting one elevated target. It is confronting the downstream shape of a system that has already been taught what to expect next. Once command loses timing power, correction becomes smaller than commitment. That is the consequence. Because the structure is no longer waiting to be told what the selected object means. It is already building around what it believes that object now requires. By the time doubt is voiced, sequence has advanced. By the time uncertainty is clarified, readiness has formed. By the time authority tries to reassert verification discipline, the architecture has already taught itself that reversal may cost more than continuation. That is how unverified selection becomes dangerous without any dramatic collapse. The system does not need to fail theatrically. It only needs to shift commitment earlier than authority can still govern it. Once that happens, the structure begins preserving the selected path rather than testing it. And preservation is a different logic than verification. Verification asks whether the object deserves structural privilege. Preservation asks how to avoid losing the advantages already built around that privilege. That is the trap. Because once the structure crosses into preservation mode, every correction arrives weaker than it should. Contradictory indicators carry less force. Alternative interpretations receive less time. Warnings feel disruptive rather than decisive. The selected object becomes institutionally protected because the system has already spent time turning it into the center of readiness. And systems defend what they have already organized around, especially under compression. So even if the selected target is downgraded later, the damage has already occurred. Attention has been consumed. Sequence has been distorted. Other possibilities have been deferred. The architecture has already been shaped by a choice that did not yet deserve that much structural weight. That is why late verification does not restore command cleanly. It reacts from behind commitment. And once authority is acting from behind the structure rather than ahead of it, the command relationship has already broken. That is the doctrine. Autonomous targeting systems do not become dangerous in command terms simply because they identify objects faster. They become dangerous when target selection begins hardening structural commitment before verification can still govern what the selection means. The issue is not that the machine lacks a verification layer. The issue is that verification only matters while it still sits ahead of commitment in the sequence that governs action. Once selection gains the power to elevate one target, narrow the field, align readiness, and compress timing before authority has validated the basis for that movement, verification is no longer functioning as command control. It is functioning as delayed commentary on a structure already in motion. And delayed commentary is not command. Command requires the power to decide before the structure commits itself. That is the threshold that matters. If machine speed selection is allowed to reorganize the system before authority has fully verified both the object and the state around it, then the human layer is no longer governing commitment. It is trying to catch it. And systems that must be caught are already ahead of command. That is why the real safeguard is not symbolic human presence somewhere in the loop. It is sequence integrity. Verification must retain the authority to determine whether elevation becomes commitment at all. And that requirement is stricter than it sounds. It means verification cannot merely survive inside the architecture as a late review ritual. It must remain the governing threshold that decides whether the structure is allowed to build downstream readiness around a selected object in the first place. If that order is lost, the rest is appearance. Review still exists. Authority still appears present. Decision rituals still continue. But the decisive act has already happened below them. The target was selected. The structure leaned. Readiness formed. And verification arrived only after the system had already begun treating one object as the truth around which time should move. That is no longer meaningful command verification. It is verification reduced to observation after commitment has already started shaping the field. And once verification is reduced to that role, authority has not merely slowed. It has been repositioned behind the very sequence it was supposed to govern. The moment selection hardens before verification can still govern it, authority is no longer choosing the target. It is arriving after the choice,